Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free from economic hardship and able to get out and do whatever you wish within the confines of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today's podcast is in honor of and in memory of Yvonne Rand, our dear Dharma sister who died on August 19th at 9:45 p.m. in her daughter Hillary's home in San Francisco. She died peacefully. She'd been in hospice care. Yvonne was a great woman, a powerful woman, an important person in helping to establish Zen Center. She was an important and close advisor to Shunryu Suzuki. I'm just going to go read stuff that I've got on her page, in her section on cuke.com, and I'm going to find some things she's written and read them. And, I think that'll be pretty good. I called Yvonne Zen Center's den mother, especially in the early Tassajara years. You know, I'd come in from Tassajara to the city, and I could stay there, and she'd be feeding people, and she'd be taking care of people. She'd know who needed what. She was the secretary of Zen Center then. She'd gotten involved through her friendship with Virginia Baker, Richard Baker's wife, and I believe they met at the Art Institute. Now, a little something. I'm just looking right now at something I wrote really quickly and put on Cuke What's New blog. I say her love of animals bordered on the humorous with the numbers she took on. She was particularly prone to animals and people who needed help. Her place with Bill, where she lived in Muir Beach, it was right after the Pelican Inn when you're driving towards Stinson, going north on Highway 1. And just as you come to the Muir Woods Road, you go straight to it. You keep going left. And that curve is where their house was. And Yvonne would keep goats, and goats would get out in the highway. And so she called her place Goat in the Road, and her website was Goat in the Road. I can't pull it up now. I've been working on her presence on the cuke.com. I had to take out a lot of links. They weren't good anymore, and Goat in the Road isn't good anymore. goatintheroad.org. But then I'll find more stuff. I'll be adding to it. So, but she didn't only take care of goats. There'd be dogs, cats, fish, tadpoles. Oh God, I remember something about a whole bunch of tadpoles. She got on a big tray with water, and she didn't know where to put it, so she put it on top of the refrigerator. Of course, then she forgot it, and they all dried up and died. But most of the animals she helped benefited, And maybe they did too. They might have died anyway, and they got to have a relationship with Yvonne beforehand. And birds, she was a birder, and so was Bill. They were serious birders. And listen, Yvonne had a library that was unbelievable. And no possible way she could have read all those books, but she was extremely well read, extremely well educated. And she'd really get into everything. Oh my God, would Bill too. When he got into Buddhism, he'd been into Greek and all sorts of classical stuff. He got into Buddhism, he got into reading Pali and Sanskrit. And they formed the Kali Peplon Society with Tom and Susan Silk. Tom Silk was a lawyer a tax lawyer for the Zen Center and for many nonprofits. He was like the most in-demand tax lawyer, seemed to me. Susan she ran the Foundation of Foundations, I believe it was called, in San Francisco. And so the four of them started the Kali Peplon Society. And when I went to Japan, well, I was having dinner with the Silks, and I told them I was going to go to Japan. And Tom said, well, how are you going to pay for that? And I said, well, I figured I'd sell my car. He said, don't sell your car. Well, the Kali Peplon Society will raise your money. So he got hold of Yvonne. And, I had to come up with the mailing list. But Yvonne wrote a letter, Tom wrote a letter, and we really put together a presentation that said I'd been doing all this stuff for Zen Center and the Nuclear Freeze and all sorts of stuff all these years. And please, they'd say, now it's our turn to help David. And they raised $8,000. They got me to Japan and covered, good Lord, like 6 months, more than 6 months. I guess I got some other money or something, but I think it did. Well, I was really living cheap. I was staying with people. I hardly ever paid to stay anywhere. And I was hitchhiking. Good Lord. I went there in 1988. So I was 43 years old, hitchhiking Japan. And anyway, they were really very, very helpful with that. Now, one thing the Kali Peplon Society did was raise money to buy Buddhas from, antique stores like Tibetan Buddhas and give them to Tibetan families. They wanted to relocate them with people who were Buddhists. So, I don't know what happened with all that, but let me tell you, they had a world-class collection of Buddhas. There were so many Buddha statues, Tibetan Buddha statues. There were hundreds, it seemed to me, there. And the Dalai Lama went into Yvonne's and Bill's home. I don't know if she was with Bill yet at that point. But the Dalai Lama looked at all of it, and he said, I don't know how someone can practice Buddhism with all this wealth around you. He said it humorously, in some humorous way. I don't know exactly how he said it. But really, there was a massive amount there. And, the Gyuto Monks, they were living with Yvonne for a while, I guess while they were traveling when they were in the Bay Area. And the Gyuto Monks were very famous. I first heard of them from Houston Smith back in the 60s when he was at Tassajara. They were the ones who each one could individually chant an octave. No, I shouldn't say an octave, wrong. Chant a chord, like 3 different voices. And, when Houston first heard it, he thought, well, that's impossible. And he got a tape and he brought it back. And everybody said, that's impossible. Well, eventually the Gyuto monks were traveling. And anytime, you get really close to some group from another culture that you have very idealistic ideas about, that will usually bring you down to earth. And, she discovered that human side of the monks. I mean, she still revered them and thought they were wonderful, but they were terrible to this kid. I mean, if the kid got bad, little tiny kid, they'd tell him, well, if you continue being bad, we're going to throw you in the fire. And he'd cry and be terrified. And Yvonne just could not stand that. I mean, she wouldn't allow that. And if you're wondering what the Gyuto monks were doing with a little tiny boy, it's because they'd be traveling with lay people who would be taking care of them. Maybe very few, maybe just one. I don't remember. I mean, I'd see them over there. But and they were neat. And I had been living at Yvonne's, not full time. I lived 76 to 85 with Elizabeth Twomey in Bolinas, but I'd half the time I either had a place in San Francisco next to my ex-wife, Diane Goldschlag, who became Daya Goldschlag, and then she moved to Muir Beach, and so Yvonne suggested I remodeled their little tack house. Tack house is a place where gear for horses go, saddles and stirrups and stuff. So it was, I completely rebuilt the walls. I kept the floor and I kept the roof. I might have re-roofed it, but I mean, I kept the structure. But one by one, I replaced the walls, made it bigger, put in a compost privy, a porch up front. I used entirely wood, not used wood, not just used wood. I used entirely wood from Green Gulch's massive pile of wood to be cut into firewood. And it was quite a trip. And a little tiny sink. And the compost privy did not smell. It sucked air in when you took the top off. And I had sawdust there. And I got a window that I put in front, and there was a little creek there, and it overlooked a creek. And then I had another window for a door, a sliding door on my left, and it had 2 tatamis. And when I stood, I could stand up in the middle. And the peak of the roof coming down, the ceiling was, I could just barely stand up in the middle. And I had sycamore wood around the edge of the tatami that had been cut at Tassajara, from a Tassajara sycamore. That's very unusual wood. Anyway, it was a wonderful little place. I loved it. And I would stay there quite a bit and go sit at Green Gulch and, to hang out with Kelly and be with Kelly there. And she was just so generous. It was really great. Never paid a cent. But she got a nice place. And she called it the Baba Yaga hut. Now, Baba Yaga is the legendary Russian witch in the woods who travels around in a hut on chicken feet and catches children and eats them. And she has her hut. It's on chicken feet, and the fence is going around it is made with bones. Now I didn't do that, but I put in the chicken feet. I got like 1-inch rebar, and paid somebody to make chicken feet out of it. And Nils Holm, my dearly departed Danish friend, who was really good plasterer, mudder. He mudded the walls, so it was a cool place. And Harry Roberts would come out and watch me, and we'd drink together. And Yvonne was great. We just always got along. She was so understanding. She could come down heavy on a lot of people, but she was always very forgiving and understanding of me. And finally, I straightened up, but we always had a good relationship, and she was always very kind to me. And Bill was too, but that's because of Yvonne. Now, the Kali Peplon Society, it's still going. I just got an email from them. It said, "Dear friends, non-parallel, beloved Yvonne Rand took her last breath at 9:45 p.m. Wednesday, August 19th. Yvonne's children, Hillary and Chris, Hillary's partner Helen, and friend Deb, washed her body and dressed her. They placed dried rose petals from her Muir Beach garden on her dress and around her head, rosemary along her sides, and while sage wands in her hands." I think they mean to say wild. "After resting in place Wednesday night, her body has been transferred to a crematorium in Tamalpais Valley, where she will be held for 3 days." Yvonne, incidentally, that crematorium in Tam Valley, that has a green cemetery. And at one point, I don't know about now, I think it was the only certified green cemetery in California. I've been in there a number of times because of cremations. Yvonne expressed wisdom, humor, compassion, and tenderness in these last few weeks. She left this world as gracefully as she lived in it. We will send additional information at a later date. The Kali Peplon Society board members. Now, they got hold of me to use some material from Kook.com on her, and it seemed to me they were students of hers. But I want to see what material I can get from them, because, these days, not just these days, for years I've learned, do not link to anything you want to keep. Take it off. So I've lost various things. I liked interviews with people on it that were elsewhere, because things don't last on the internet. The internet loses a few 100,000 pages every day. There are archives that capture a great deal. But anyway, forget about that. So my point is that Yvonne was very, very generous and kind to plants and animals and me. Psychic Anne Armstrong said that Yvonne astral traveled to accidents at night while she was sleeping. Yvonne had many students and was close with many fellow students and many people outside of Zen Center. One thing she did with Suzuki Roshi was to introduce him to subjects outside of Buddhism that she thought were relevant and important for him to know. For instance, about American Indians and about ecology. Here we go. Yvonne spent a good deal of time with hospice work and taught us how to sit with and take care of the bodies of the departed, how to wash them and how to plug them so they didn't run. And she also would get together groups of women who'd had abortions or miscarriages, and they would sew little tiny raksus. Now, the raksu, for those who don't know, is a miniature version of the large robe of ordination that's sewn in out of little squares and rectangles representing a rice field, and worn around the neck and hanging below. So if you were ordained as a layperson, you would get a raksu. If you were ordained as a priest, you would get an okesa. That's the outside robe, and that's a large robe that, but it's also just a big rectangle that's sewed in that same way. And priests wear raksus too, quite a bit. The okesa is for the formal occasions and zazen. And Yvonne did eventually get ordained as a priest, not by Suzuki, but by Katagiri in Minnesota. And she became one of Katagiri's Dharma heirs. Anyway, she'd get together these groups of women, and they'd sew these little tiny raksus for the life within them that had not been born. And then they'd get a Gyuto statue. I might be misrepresenting this. I can probably find something to read on it. And they'd put the little raksu on the Gyuto statue. And Gyuto is the bodhisattva, very popular in Japan for children and travelers. Sort of like, what's the one that people carry in their cars, the Christian one? I can't remember right now. Let me see if I can find that. Yep, I started to say it, but I made sure. St. Christopher. Jesus is a little bit like, not Jesus, Gyuto is a little bit like St. Christopher. Now, there are temples in Japan that specialize in being a place for a woman who's had an abortion to come, or a miscarriage to come, and they would buy a little Gyuto from the temple and put it, do some chanting or whatever, and put it in the place in the temple, like in the temple garden with others. And I've been to temples in Japan that had hundreds and hundreds of them. Well, come to think of it, I've seen surely thousands and thousands of them in some temples. Contraceptives, when I was living there, were illegal. Well, the pill was illegal. I was there 88 to 92. And, but not other contraceptive means. They had nothing against contraception. They were just worried that reduced condom use would increase transmission of STDs. So it wasn't until 1999 that some of them started being allowed to come in with prescription. And so as Yvonne would get together with women, and as they'd sew these raksus, they would talk about that. Just talk about the whole subject of having an abortion, how they felt, etc. Yvonne also studied with Maureen Stewart and the Dalai Lama and Tara Tulku, and had some closeness to Shodo Harada. Shodo Harada Roshi, Maureen Stewart Roshi, the Venerable, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, the Venerable Tara Tulku. But her primary path was Zen, augmented by practices and teachings from the traditions of Theravada and Vajrayana. I'm reading this. Ms. Rand incorporates insights from Western psychotherapeutic traditions in her teaching. She also investigates the relevance of the arts and gardening for training the mind. When I first met Yvonne, she was married to Ken Rand, who was at the time managing the Mingei-ya, a really nice country Japanese restaurant near the marina in San Francisco. I went on to be very close with Ken, who started the minimum daily requirement, like a little hot dog place in North Beach, the MDR. And then he and Freddie Miller, with Freddie Miller's house, bought the and created the Sand Dollar in Stinson Beach, where, and Ken ran that until he died. And my wife, Katrinka, used to work in the Sand Dollar. That was before she became manager of the Pelican Inn in Muir Beach. Right through the woods. There, I used to walk right through the woods there when I stayed at Yvonne's. Go right by the Pelican Inn on my way to Green Gulch, sometimes in the early dark morning. Yvonne and Ken had 2 children, Christopher and Hillary. And Christopher and Hillary were with Yvonne when she died. And also, she was living at Hillary's in hospice ever since her husband Bill died. Now, she and Bill lived in Philo, a little further up Mendocino County. They'd lived in Muir Beach, right near Green Gulch Farm for years, but I don't know, a decade or so, 20 years ago, I can't remember ago, they moved up to Philo. Nice little community, and she had little cabins there for students to stay in. And William Sterling, his father was the chancellor of Stanford, and Yvonne and Bill were very, very close for many years, and he didn't die long ago. Let me see. Yep, that's what I remembered. He died on December 1st last year. And Yvonne had dementia, maybe it was Alzheimer's, toward the end of her life. And I was in touch with her, by email and occasionally by phone up to about a year before she died. After that, I'd stay in touch with Bill. I'm not closing the doors or windows here. Give you a little life in Bali. The rooster isn't going anymore. Here's, let me read you something that Frank Ostaseski wrote and sent when Yvonne went into hospice. So he just did this, a few weeks ago. Frank Ostaseski is the founding head of the San Francisco Zen Center's Zen Hospice. I was on the board when we chose him. And the whole proposal for that came to us through Martha Freebaron Smith, who became Martha DeBarros, and another woman who was working with her, whose name I forget, but who I'd first met when we worked together on Californians for a Nuclear Freeze. And Martha had been decades, even back then, had been decades working with hospice in San Francisco, maybe the San Francisco Hospice. And Martha and Yvonne, I believe, were roommates at Stanford. They were very close, and Martha had a home in Muir Beach, so they were always very close. So Frank says, keeping Yvonne Rand in my heart and practice today, she entered hospice care and is turning toward her transition. Yvonne, a meditation teacher, in the Soto Zen lineage, began her practice and study of Zen with Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. Later, she studied with many other masters. Yvonne was part of the original advisory group that gave birth to the Zen Hospice project. I'm feeling deep gratitude for her life and work and friendship. It was Yvonne who taught me about Jizo, Bodhisattva, and how to ritually bathe the body after death. We did it a number of times together before I introduced the ritual and Jizo statues to our staff and volunteers at Zen Hospice, and later to Metta Institute clinicians and students. Yvonne could genuinely be described as a force of nature. Powerful, impeccable, with fierce compassion, great humor, and with a non-stop commitment to Dharma practice and the empowerment of women. Yvonne was a brilliant teacher of Buddhist and other teachings on death and conscious dying. She was instrumental in creating the Jizo Garden at Green Gulch Farm, a powerful refuge where we conducted many memorials. Her contributions, too many to count. That's true. I spoke with a friend who was with her yesterday for a beautiful soul-to-soul meeting. Yvonne, despite her recent confusion, would surface into presence and simplicity without perseveration. I trust her access to the mind stream. She has guided so many through this process. She will find her way. Thank you, Yvonne. May your practice guide you. Gate, gate, para, gate, parasam, gate, bodhi, svaha. Okay, I'm going to read here something Yvonne wrote with help from her husband, Bill. Suzuki Roshi had cancer of the gallbladder. He was in Portland doing a combinations of sittings and lectures in March of 1971, the year he died. He got sick very suddenly, and it looked like he had a gallbladder attack and his gallbladder was taken out. As a matter of routine, there was an autopsy of his gallbladder and it was cancerous. The doctor who did the operation was quite certain he'd gotten everything out. The surrounding tissue was the right color and healthy looking. So Suzuki Roshi didn't say anything to anybody and proceeded with life as usual. In fact, Suzuki Roshi became sick and didn't have much energy that spring. By summer, it was very clear to him that he wasn't going to live much longer. He went to Tassajara that summer, and he was beginning to have physical signs that things weren't very good. He didn't say anything, and the only other person who knew was his wife, who was at Tassajara with him. People who were at Tassajara that summer talked a lot, especially afterwards, about the fierceness he had about everything he did. He did everything. More rock work than usual, lectures every night. There was this incredible energy in everything he did. And in late August, I went to Tassajara to drive him up here to the Bay Area, San Francisco. That was August 18th. On the way, we stopped at San Juan Bautista to join the last day of a sesshin that Soen Roshi was leading, Soen Nakagawa Roshi. We got back to San Francisco, and by then Suzuki Roshi was beginning to be jaundiced, and we made some terrible jokes about his getting to be more yellow. He went to bed not feeling very well, and basically never left his bed after that. That was in late August, and he died in early September. Well, wait a minute here. He gave a couple of other talks in the Zendo. But it didn't have much left. And I think his last talk was August 21st, and it was the only talk he gave after he came back from Tassajara. Back to Yvonne. He declined physically very rapidly. It took about a month of tests and fiddling around for the doctor to determine that he had cancer. In fact, initially his doctor was quite certain he had hepatitis, and so we did all the quarantine stuff that goes with it. None of the usual things happened. He didn't get better when he should have, so eventually he went to Mount Zion for some tests. By that time, we had gone through several weeks of his having to eat on a separate plate and all the work of keeping his dishes separate. It was a drag. He didn't particularly like it. He was used to a much easier atmosphere, the practical details of getting food on the table, etc. I went to see him after we'd been in the hospital a couple of days. When I got to his room, the doctor and a couple of specialists had just left, and he motioned to me and asked me to sit down on the bed next to him. He said, "I have cancer." He just mouthed the words as if he was telling me some good thing in a whisper. His lunch had just been brought in. It was on a table by his bed. He patted the seat next to him and said, "Now we can eat off the same plate." And he began to feed me some of his lunch. He'd have a bite, and then I'd have a bite, which, of course, is what we couldn't do as long as we thought he had hepatitis. And he said, "This cancer is my friend, and my practice will be to take care of this sickness." From that point on, that was very much the feeling that I had from him, about his sickness and about all of us who were a part of his life, and in particular his doctor. It was very much a situation of his taking care of the doctor rather than the doctor taking care of him. So at one point, the doctor brought him some pain medicine. That was after we had brought him back to Page Street, and at that time he was still in his bedroom upstairs. And the doctor was quite concerned about his being uncomfortable and brought him a prescription for pain medication, which Suzuki Roshi let sit on the nightstand for a few days. Eventually, he took one of these pills. It was quite obvious he didn't want to take it, as he didn't like the way it made him feel. He was taking it basically because he knew the doctor wanted him to take it and was worrying about him, and he decided the kindest thing he could do was to do what the doctor wanted him to do. I learned something from watching him do this with the doctor. Anyway, he was basically in his own bed, and when he got weaker and weaker, we got a hospital bed and moved him to the room that is now the Kaisando Founders Hall, so that he could look out onto the courtyard below, see the sun, hear the bells, and have a sense of the rhythm of people to and from the Zendo and a sense of being a part of the life of the building. He gradually became weaker and weaker and soon was not able to get out of bed. The kinds of things he wanted to have done for him were simple. He wanted his arms rubbed and his legs rubbed, and he enjoyed a glass of fresh orange juice. He enjoyed eating. There was a quality of being completely present with each person who came to talk with him or sit with him. This incredible, vast space, there wasn't anything happening except what he was doing at that moment. There was some dismay among some of his students that he wasn't going to live very long. The sadness he expressed was, "It's too bad that you were hanging on to me." Without talking about it very much, he demonstrated a quality of just letting go. At the same time, he was concerned with taking care of the situation so that things would continue after he died. After he had finished the mountain seat ceremony, the installation ceremony for Baker Roshi, which he did get out of bed to do about a week before he died. He was very weak and basically couldn't walk by himself. He was supported by someone on either side of him. Yeah, his son Hoitsu. I could look at the picture, but Hoitsu was on one side. Although he did walk from the entrance of the Buddha Hall to the main altar, by himself. He did that part of the ceremony and went to his seat. He really made an effort to do that. Up to that point, he had been in bed continuously. After the ceremony, he stopped eating, and after about 3 days, he stopped drinking and he died within a couple of days after that. About the time he stopped eating, he stopped talking. My experience since then has been that sequence is rather characteristic if people are left alone. If there is a situation, she doesn't mean completely left alone to their own devices, not that there isn't somebody taking care of them. If there is a situation where they are not being fiddled with a lot and they are ready to die and have somehow gotten their selves and their lives in order so that there is some timeliness to the way they are dying, in that situation, there seems to be some characteristic rhythm, and it seems to cover some period between a week and 10 days. The person will usually stop talking, stop eating, and then stop drinking, and then within a few days will die. I remember in that week, Suzuki Roshi would occasionally pull out his arms, which at that time were incredibly thin. He'd pull one arm out and stick it into the air. He wanted to have someone rub his arm. We'd rub it, he'd stick it back under, and a little while later, one of those little arms. The other one, right? But at that point, his wife and I, one of us, was always with him. We had been with him such a long time that we were all in a shared rhythm. We didn't require much talking, and we'd been in the room together and breathing together for a long time, so there was some shared physical rhythm. When I was with Judy this March, I don't know who that is, I had almost exactly the same experience. Another woman and I took care of her together, and we actually slept in the room with her. One of us would take turns being more awake so the other one could rest. What happened, without arranging or saying it, this is what we were doing. The three of us were breathing together for those 5 days. What I would notice when I was resting is that without thinking about it, my body inclination was to join her breathing. And it would occur when she would get a little scared or panicky. And I would breathe in a particular way and make a sound in my breathing. She would join my breathing and get a couple of breaths. That was a way of helping her be more calm. Anyway, I don't know if that gives you some feeling of what I mean about my experience with being with Suzuki Roshi. The other aspect of it is, I think, that I was struck with how little there was to do. It was possible to do a few things to keep him comfortable, wipe his face, and when he stopped drinking, keep his lips and his mouth moist. Things of that sort that were pretty obvious. But at some level, there really wasn't anything to do except sit there and keep him company. That was in 1971. In 68 or 69, I met a woman who was a psychiatrist and worked in New York and had worked with hospital staffs in several big hospitals in New York City. One of the things she stumbled on was that a very high percentage of people die unattended, that in the moment of dying, the nurses and doctors were all somewhere else. So when she noticed how that seemed to be the case, she did a study and discovered that the statistics were very high. She began working with nursing staffs in several big hospitals, working with them around their feelings of being with people when they die. This was at a point before there was much of a hospice movement. In this country, particularly in hospitals with professional medical people, a fairly consistent attitude prescribed. Once the patient is close to dying, there's not much they can do, and the staff seem to experience a sense of failure in the very process to which they were professionally committed. She and her husband and another man they were with were coming here to San Francisco and spending time at Tassajara that summer. In the midst of doing this work, I met her and she told me a little about it. I hadn't thought much about the work she was doing until after Suzuki Roshi died, and it was at that point that I became willing to sit with the dying. That seemed to be something that not so many people were interested in doing. In fact, my experience is that most people in America today have never been around death. In fact, It is one of those experiences which once was very common and no longer is in people's lives. At the turn of the century, it wasn't at all unusual that by the time you were an adult, you would have lived through several deaths in your family, your grandparents, some siblings, a neighbor. The person was very likely to have died at home in bed. There would be a wake, the practice of sitting with the body for some time, usually 3 days. It's really within this century that this experience has become so rare. One of the reasons I emphasize that ordinary quality is that one of the things I hear from people, particularly in Zen Center, when they are with someone who is dying, is feeling inadequate, like, gosh, I'm not doing something I should be doing. They feel there is something they don't know. My bias is that the willingness to keep someone company and stay with them while they're going through this transition is quite a lot. It's enough. My own experience is that simply dropping that attitude has led me into situations where I've had the most intimate experience with another person that I've ever had under any circumstances. I say that without exception. It hasn't depended on a personal relationship. Out of the willingness simply to keep someone company, it has seemed sufficient for the other person, and it has consistently been, without exception, in a situation in which I have learned something quite important for me. I think it is very related to Zazen practice, to the whole field of mindfulness practice. I think that there may be something about what brings us to this practice that makes it possible for us to keep someone company in a way which I think is a real gift. I think we have something to offer in that willingness. It is that territory that I find very compelling and that I am sharing and supporting all of you to explore for yourselves. That comes completely out of my experience in being in that space with people. And when I use the word intimacy, I mean the intimacy you have with your own child or with a lover, a quality of closeness with another person, which is very hard to describe. I'm going to read an interview with Yvonne Rand by Dinah Macy of the Yoga Journal. I do not have a date. I'm not going to try to look it up. I figure it's somewhere between 2000 and 2010. Incidentally, everything I'm reading, I'm just getting off Yvonne's page on Cuke.com. Skipping the introductory material here and some questions and comments and answers following. Question. We are bombarded daily by images in the media that youth, and only youth, is beautiful, powerful images that can greatly affect how we perceive ourselves. What can we do to move beyond them? Yvonne. There is a certain amount of bombarding from the culture that one has some choices about. For example, I just don't watch television and I don't read most magazines. Good answer, Yvonne. Question, do you feel disengaged from the world because of this? Yvonne, no, it's not a disengagement from the world, but a disengagement from marketing, from propaganda, a disengagement from being told how the world is, instead placing significant priority on direct experience. Question, what are some of the Buddhist teachings on impermanence that are useful as people grow older? Yvonne, the possibility of the alleviation of suffering in the Buddhist tradition has to do with focusing on what are called the 3 marks. The fact that there is suffering, that everything changes, and that there is no permanent solid self. Question then, who are we? Yvonne Rand, well, we're not permanent and solid, but that doesn't mean there isn't a self. There's a self. It's just not the self of the sort we think exists. Meditations on impermanence can be a kind of access point to the experience. Not the intellectual understanding, but the actual experience of no solid permanent self. When we understand that all there is coming and going, that in itself brings about significant lessening of suffering. Question, why do you think some people feel sadness or fear when their faces and bodies change? Yvonne, change is inevitable, and resisting this inevitability can cause intense suffering. I mean, what can we do? Well, there's a lot we can do these days about wrinkles and sagging, but even those medical procedures are not without suffering. And the bottom line is that when we resist change, we are poorly prepared for our own dying or the dying of those dear to us. And that means that we are far more likely to die in a fearful state of mind than we are with a calm and happy mind, and that's a huge difference. For me, I learned a great deal on how it was possible to die as a consequence of sitting with Suzuki Roshi in the last few months of his life, and then subsequently sitting with people over the years as they were dying. And I got to see the difference between turning away from impermanence and turning towards it. Question, what's the difference? Yvonne. Well, my mother, for example, was the polar opposite of Suzuki Roshi. I remember when she began to age, she was very upset, and I said to her, did you ever know anybody who did not get old? And though she said yes, she said she never thought it would happen to her. She was very fearful and suffered incredibly in an effort to control what she couldn't control. I know somebody who died of metastasized breast cancer when she was 57, and she had the body of a 20-year-old. She had a lot of cosmetic surgery, and she was very beautiful. And the doctors were just gaga over this beautiful woman to the point that in some cases they weren't always so attentive to what was going on for her as she was closer and closer to dying. And dying was very hard for her because even though she was very beautiful, she was dying. We're all dying all the time. We have the minor dying when we go to sleep and a kind of minor birth when we wake up. We have a kind of minor dying when something ends, when you and I hang up on the telephone, or when someone we love comes to visit and then goes away. These are minor dyings, and if we don't turn away from them, we begin to be more open to the joy and beauty of experience that's not separable from sadness. Joy and sadness are not separable. Question, I see a great expenditure of energy in both younger women and older women to maintain a fixed state of beauty. And it's an interesting choice to make because that's an allocation of energy that could possibly be used elsewhere. Yvonne, well, there's something heartbreaking for me when I see someone older who's trying to look younger. There's a huge amount of suffering in resisting the fact of change. I had an incredible experience with a particular rose that grows in our garden. Someone had made a bouquet of the honey-colored blossoms and put them in a white milk pitcher, and it was just unbelievably beautiful. And I ran to get the camera to take the picture, and in the middle of it, I stopped myself and realized, grasping. So instead, I let the bouquet sit on the altar, and as the roses began to fade, the petals fell off. We just let it stay for a month. That was pretty interesting. So there's this impulse to capture, to grasp, hang on to, that comes out of our conditioning to grab and grasp. I think that a lot of people, because they're afraid, have that impulse to freeze a moment, to hang on to something that delights us, instead of experiencing the delight that includes the momentary nature of whatever it is that delights us. What if someone looks in the mirror and says, well, my aging has caused me to suffer, so I'll change my face or body. I will alleviate the cause of my suffering. That's the question. Yvonne, I don't think it's an accurate statement. I think it's that tendency to say that my suffering is caused by something outside and not recognize that the suffering I experience is happening in my mind. It has to do with my reaction to the wrinkles. It's not the wrinkles themselves. It's my reaction to them. And the difference between reaction and response is huge. Question, and how do you feel when you look at yourself and see yourself change? Yvonne, well, I use that as an occasion for returning to the fact that everything changes. Nothing remains the same, including skin. I mean, I've actually done meditations on hair, nails, and sagging skin, taking on as a focus for noticing change when I might want to turn away. Okay, for the next week or 10 days, I will bring my attention to standing in front of the mirror and noticing, bringing attention to, sagging impermanence of the body. And I won't linger with that attention on sagging long enough to get caught with storytelling about it. I'll notice and come back to the present moment by bringing attention to the alignment of the head, heart center, and hara, and the breath. Question, what would be an example of getting lost in storytelling? Yvonne, oh, look at that sagging belly. Oh, I need to exercise more. Oh, I'm such a slob. Why am I so lazy? What's wrong with me? I'll never change. Question, all right, the judge. Yvonne Rand, yes. And for Americans, habitual judgment is very, very dominant. Every Asian teacher or Buddhist teacher I've ever talked to has commented on how fearsome we seem to be in this culture with respect to judging ourselves and everything else. You know, self-judgment directed toward oneself that gets projected out. And it's a significant hindrance to the cultivation of one's capacity to be present. It's a very serious obstacle. Some years ago, during some of the mind science meetings at Harvard with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, had a very hard time believing how pervasive judgment is for us Americans. It was like, how can this be? Question, what is the foundation of fierce judgment? Yvonne, I think it's essentially based on fear. If you drop deep enough under judgment, there's fear. Any reaction, if it's deeply set, has become a habit. And it's important to understand that the very nature of a habit is that it's tenacious. So dismantling a habit requires willingness to see the pattern and then to doggedly and determinedly keep noticing and coming back into the present moment. Because if you notice the pattern and linger, you're going to get caught in the storytelling, and that re-energizes the very reactive pattern that you're seeking to dismantle. Question, does becoming enlightened mean that you don't have reactivity? Yvonne, yeah, I think so. My experience being with people who are significantly awake is that they are people who are sublimely present, and presence and reactivity don't go together. Question, what does it feel like to be in an enlightened person's presence? Yvonne, vastly spacious. It's one of the reasons why I say to various people I practice with, if you ever have a chance to take teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, please do so that you will have the experience of what it's like to be in the presence of someone who is deeply awake and present. There's a word in Tibetan called kundun, which means the presence. And you know, one of the extraordinary experiences as a Buddhist practitioner is to be with practitioners who have cultivated significant capacities to be awake, to be fully present. It's a way to have a taste, if you will, for what you're aiming towards, what you're seeking to cultivate. And I think having that taste experientially is incredibly useful. Question, what are some other classic meditations on impermanence? Yvonne Rand, that death is inevitable, that death can come at any time. Meditation on the actual dying process, or what I call my dress rehearsal, and meditating on what happens after one dies. There's another meditation recitation called the Five Remembrances. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to avoid having ill health. I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love is of the nature to change. There is no way to avoid being separated from them. My deeds are my constant companions. My deeds are the ground on which I stand. I am my own protector. Question. What do you find joyful about growing older? Yvonne Rand. Well, I have some sense and some degree of cultivation of the mind. I'm grateful for each day and what comes. I actually have a vivid sense of impermanence. You know, I'm not that far away from 70. So, a sense of the impermanence of this body and of this life is quite vivid. And for that, I'm quite grateful. I do not put things off as I did when I was younger, and the result is that I have less that I regret. To live without regret is quite sweet. All right. Jana Macy is the communications director of Yoga Journal magazine. She's a writer and musician and lives with her family in Berkeley. Now, she said she was approaching 70. Let's see. And she'd turned 70 in 2005, so this interview was before then, and it was approaching, so maybe 2002, 3, 4. Okay. I'm going to read now from, this is on Shambhala.com, Yvonne Rand. And it's Yvonne Rand, a profile from Meetings with Remarkable Buddhist Women by Lenore Friedman. This came out a long time ago. Let me see if it says in the bottom here, because I'm reading it online now. I've got it on Cute.com on her page too. Nah. Hey, you know, I could see when the book came out. Let me see. It says August 15th, 2000. That's 20 years ago. I think it's older than that, and this is a re-release. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I think they should have to say, and maybe they do somewhere, but when it was first published, for my benefit. Okay, this dates it right, the first sentence. For 20 years, ever since she met Shunryu Suzuki Roshi in I'm going to have to make the page a little bigger. 66. Well, I knew what the date was. It's interesting. It's right there. It's a mistake. Shunryu is spelling it R-Y-O instead of R-Y-U. In 1960. So 20 years since then, 66, 76, 86. So that it sounds right to me. So this book came out in the late 1980s. You know, it tells about how she's done all this stuff, Zen Center, and says most recently she's lived and worked at Zen Center's facility in Marin County, Green Gulch Farm. Wow. Is that before she had the house at Muir Beach? Yeah, you know, I guess she got the house with Bill Sterling, come to think of it. Yeah. No, maybe not. I don't know. All right. Yvonne is an articulate, forthright, down-to-earth woman with whom it is invigorating to talk. Well, that's sure true. Among her most important teachers, she told me, have been a series of older, ill, and dying people, both ordinary and extraordinary, with whom she's worked very closely over the past 15 years. The first was Suzuki Roshi, who died in 71. 2 years ago, it was Lama Govinda, the renowned Lama Anagariga Govinda, the renowned author and scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. Before he died, he said to her, "Be willing to give up all the forms we've been accustomed to following and go back to the original teachings of the Buddha." Yvonne was struck by this advice and it has guided her ever since. As a result, she has been incorporating into her own practice and teaching a variety of methods originating not only from Zen, but from Vipassana and Tibetan traditions as well. Well, Tibetan tradition is certainly not original Buddhism. It came much later. But other than that, it's true. For her personally, two of the most important have been the practices of breath walking and of the half smile, each of which she learned from the gentle Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh. Learn to walk as a Buddha walks, to smile as a Buddha smiles, he says. You can do it. Why wait until you become a Buddha? Be a Buddha right now, at this very moment. Yvonne now practices the half smile at stoplights and in grocery lines, having breath-oriented practices that can be done for 1 to 3 breaths in the midst of activity has helped her experience a connectedness between the states of mind that arise in formal meditation and those arising in everyday life. Other practices, especially with the precepts or rules for conduct, have been useful in examining deeper levels of herself, levels beyond action and language and thought. Layers of resistance and denial had to be plumbed, but now she experiences a much wider range of connection with other people. A Vipassana forgiveness meditation, for example, has been useful in working with her fierce, judging voice, that voice so peculiar to American and Western minds, which Yvonne perceives as a wall or hindrance to being awake. Yeah, I'm DC here commenting. She was aware of that. That was like her dark side, say. But she also said, she would say, I loved it. 99% of that which we say about others is about ourselves. So back to the article. The precepts are absolutely necessary ground for her. I can't be calm if my behavior is off, she said. Sometimes she will use one precept as a mantra, or she will hold in the background of her mind the image of a sieve, each of whose wires are the precept through which she passes everything she does or thinks or says during the day. This creates a grid. Large holes or small, depending on the gross or subtle material which I intend to pass through it, she says. I have to add that because there's quotes, This image came out of her working in her garden and noticing how different gradations of sieves determine the soil one can make. Images have more liveliness, she believes, if they come out of concrete experience. Yvonne respects the way practice grabs us. One of the precepts often jumps off the page at me from an intuitive, barely conscious awareness of exactly where an edge is at any moment. For instance, the precept about not stealing or not taking what is not given, a translation Yvonne prefers, has expanded for her into an acceptance of things as they are, which has been very, very powerful, she says. She says the precept acts like a rope along a pathway and has allowed her to move through and be done with old patterns more effectively than any other single practice she has done up to now. With its constant reminders of impermanence, she says, Buddhism helps us cultivate non-possessiveness toward everything, including our personalities, who it is we think we are. Mindfulness practice, with its emptiness on being awake to whatever arises, teaches us to relate to our stickiness and corruptibility as grist for the mill. Aversion is an obstacle to seeing things as they are. Seeing leads to the possibility of transformation. We're all corruptible, she says, but the degree to which we know our capacity for corruptibility, that is, the roles and masks we wear that cause disharmony or harm to ourselves and others, is the degree to which we don't act on it. There is a Tibetan practice called the inner offering that Yvonne finds very useful here. Imagine, she says, a bowl carved out of a human skull. She recently brought one back from India. I'm sure she couldn't declare that. Fill it with whatever stands for the dark side in you: blood, bones, shit, instruments of mayhem and torture, whiskey, demons. With a chopper, chop it all into tiny bits until it is transformed into nectar, which then can be an offering. In the same way, we can chop up our corruptibility and transform it into an offering, Yvonne says. Working with these different approaches from other schools of Buddhism has brought her back, refreshed, to traditional Zen practice. She is now interested in re-examining some of its formal aspects, such as Doksan, that's the private interview with the teacher, and certain rituals in the Zendo. She asks penetrating questions about power, authority, dependency, and relationships within the community of practitioners. How can we cultivate interdependence while, for example, we are doing retreats and giving lectures? Over and over in meditation centers all over the U.S., issues of authority and projection are coming up in our understanding of the Zen tradition as coming from Japan. We include robes from Tang Dynasty China, shaved heads, formality in meetings, hierarchy in the authority structure, and a tradition which, in its ideal form, includes long periods of living a daily monastic life with one's teacher. If I give a lecture in my traditional robes, I can feel an increase in the degree of authority which the people listening to my lecture attribute to me. Well said, Yvonne. They edge toward accepting what I say as true, without really examining and questioning it. Subtle changes, but they go deep, begetting a kind of handing oneself over. This is sometimes useful in one's learning process, but it is also dangerous to student and to teacher alike, if not really conscious and within clear boundaries. DC comment here. Yeah, this is boilerplate, Yvonne. This is good. You see, she was like, in some ways, she was one of the people who was the conscience of the Zen Center. Sometimes she got overboard and there was too much conscience. But often she was right on, And yeah, it's really good to read that. And she could be fun. She could enjoy nature. But she was a person who thought deeply and was always penetrating into reality. So she says, each of us needs to be in a feedback system. Without that, we can fool ourselves about what we are actually doing to ourselves and to others. I find a deep resonance with the Buddhist tradition of being a spiritual friend. I can be on the path with another and offer what I have found in my practice. If my experience can be helpful to another, that is great. And if it is not useful or helpful, that is all right too. We can, in any event, walk this path together. Some very specific, bold, and concrete questions have been surfacing. For example, Yvonne wants to know, quote, how do those of us in teaching positions get others to shed light on our shadow side so that we ourselves can see it? She's been encouraging students to do this recently, but that's not enough. She feels it needs to be done with peers as well. Quote, we need to hear what our peers have to say, no matter how discomforting. One suggestion she makes is for weekly peer consultation groups for people at Zen Center who conduct practice interviews with students. What, she wonders, would constitute an environment safe enough for looking at our shadow side? The group would have to be small, but not too small. 5 people would be the perfect size, she believes. There would have to be agreements about process, for example, a commitment to self-revealing and real contact with each other, a shared interest in each other's development, a willingness to attend each other's lectures and interviews, and to share critiques. In other words, a totally open process that would be revolutionary in most traditional Zen settings, and certainly at Zen Center. Yvonne's teaching activities at present include Sunday lectures at Green Gulch once every 4 or 5 weeks, leading a day of mindfulness once a month, including zazen, breath walking, half smile, and simple physical work, periodic workshops, and weekend retreats on Zen and mindfulness practice at Green Gulch and elsewhere, retreats on death and dying, and workshops using pain as a teacher. And that does not mean people are inflicting pain on themselves or each other. And profession-specific retreats for people in the helping professions, lawyers, nurses, and doctors. She is primarily interested in working with householders, lay people, practicing in ordinary life. Since she was a child, Yvonne has felt a special affinity for adolescents and old people. Quote, when developmentally things are up for grabs, challenging and yeasty. And she really had a way with words, huh? And she wants to continue working with these age groups in the future. She also wants to work with people in mainstream work situations, giving longer, more intensive retreats in business and industrial settings. She says she wants to explore visible versus invisible practice, and her trajectory seems to be to extend herself farther and farther into the ordinary world from the intentional community that has been her base for 20 years. So then there's a post note. It says, in response to my updating questions, Yvonne Rand wrote me the following letter, which I have lightly edited. Dear Lenore, you ask me, where is my life right now? Where is my practice? My home path continues to be Soto Zen with significant amplifications from the stream of the elders. That's Vipassana Theravada. And the heart-centered practices of Himalayan Buddhism. That would be Vajrayana. Beginning in the winter of 1985-86, I was fortunate to meet and begin studying with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Venerable Tara Tulku, then the abbot of the Tibetan monastery in Bodh Gaya, India. Over the years, Tara Tulku was abbot of that. I've been there. Wow. Over the years, until Tara Tulku died, I was able to study closely with him, and most important, to study him and his life. I learned more than I probably yet know from his great and deep mind and heart, and especially from his continuous expression of boundless compassion. He supported me in staying with my home path in a way that now seems remarkable. He took interest in teaching me about how and what to teach, and with him I had a taste of what a fully androgynous person looks and feels like. I have been teaching at Redwood Creek Dharma Center in Marin County since the late 80s. Our center is small and eccentric, set in the midst of a beautiful garden with places to meditate both outdoors and in. Developing this center has given me a chance to express my artistic inclinations to create a place filled with beauty and fun. The situation has grown slowly and organically and is small enough so that I can know the people I practice with quite well. That's interesting. I mean, it sounds like her home, and it might be because her home had a special little cabin for her to do Doksan. It had paths for walking meditation. It had another cabin I can think of. It was beautiful, beautiful garden. And Steve Stuckey was the gardener. Says, I also have the great fortune to be studying with a Zen teacher who is a real yogi, Shodo Harada Roshi from Sogenji Temple in Japan. She met him when she came to visit Elin and me in Japan, and I lived next door. We lived next door to Sogenji there for 4 years. And she says, since the early 90s, I have met regularly with a number of teachers from various Buddhist schools and traditions. The contact and friendship that have grown out of these meetings help me keep an eye on my own capacity for self-deception and other pitfalls that lie in wait for anyone occupying a teaching seat. I value the company and feedback from colleagues and friends willing to speak up when they notice something I might need and want to notice myself. We discuss our teaching lives and give each other suggestions and inspiration. In the fall of 1997, I was diagnosed with cancer and subsequently had surgery. Yes, I remember that. That was serious. And I visited her in the hospital. I think she was too out of it to remember. That was at UC Med Center in San Francisco. The entire journey from diagnosis through recovery was a great teaching and a chance to go deeply into breath practices of the most ancient and reliable sort. I found affirmation that Dharma practice is exactly the resource I have always known it to be. The challenge of this time was learning to receive help, to be helpless with grace, and to taste the extraordinary experience of being prayed for. I am now old enough for the teachings on impermanence to have become more than theoretical, as though they were ever other than that. My mother died last year in her 90s after a long and unhappy life. Despite all the experiences I have had being with people as they die, I found her passing remarkable and difficult. Today I lead retreats, both long and short, give Dharma talks fairly often, enjoy working both individually and in groups with all sorts of people, cultivating an authentic spiritual life. I continue to lead a ceremony for children who have died through abortion. Those aren't children, Yvonne. Those are fetuses. They're children after they're babies who have died through but yeah, we know what you mean. Who have died through abortion, miscarriage, and sudden infant death. I do this ceremony once a season and find that more and more people, as they hear about it, respond to the container it can provide for the grief and suffering that otherwise may linger unresolved for years. In the past several years, I have been invited to teach in situations that are not identified as Buddhist and have found the forays into the larger American secular world quite stimulating. A long-standing interest for me has been to find ways of talking about the Buddha Dharma in language and with images that arise out of our own cultural context, and to find ways to make Buddhism accessible to people in the mainstream. I am currently writing a book on right speech. I find writing as another form of teaching quite enjoyable, and at the same time, the process of writing is teaching me. Well, I'd like to get hold of that. I know she was working on a book a lot, but she never did come out with one. Recently, I've been exploring how to live a life that is less busy and less scheduled and has consequently more opportunity for spontaneity. The long time I had for recovering from surgery taught me a lot about the high price we Americans pay for our dense and busy lives. And you can see what a dense and busy life she had. But listen, there were lots of periods where she'd be in retreat and in nature. She had a very full life, and she filled it with, gosh, so much. This really reminds me of all this stuff. I have worked all of my life since I was 13 years old. This is the first time I have truly just stopped for an extended period of time. I noticed a vast difference in my life, inner and outer. For example, I am meeting individually with a rather small number of students these days, and I notice that with few appointments, I have large blocks of time that I can now spend writing or studying or working in the garden. I have time to sit in the morning sun or to watch the birds. I experience creative energy arising often and in ways that leave me surprised and delighted. For years, I have aimed to do more or less. Now I am beginning actually to get the taste of what this way of living feels like. There is an enriching of the day's experiences that seems to come with any special bidding or expectation on my part. And my teaching is different, goes deeper as a result. There is a price to pay for this shift, but I think a simpler lifestyle is exactly what is needed to cultivate the heart-mind deeply, and I like it. In addition to writing, I am drawn back to my old friends, clay and stone. I do not know what will become of this shift toward quietness, but I do know I am very much enjoying my life now. Wow. Okay. That's good. That's really good. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to read an interview with Yvonne that I conducted 1994, February 11th, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. I'm not going to read the whole interview. I'm just going to read from it. So, what do you think about Suzuki Roshi? I asked her. She said, Suzuki Roshi was unusual in that he wasn't ethnocentric. That makes Suzuki Roshi particularly exceptional to some degree because of the stuff that I started thinking about just before we went to Europe. That was stimulated by being in Austria and France for a while. Now, he didn't go with her to Europe. She went to Europe with somebody. To the degree that Japan is a closed tribal culture, is a culture that has survived by having a strong impulse to reject outsiders, very much turned into itself. Japanese people very much referencing Japan and not much else. I think Suzuki Roshi is quite unusual for his very early interest in learning English and his interest in going to America, which I think is pretty unusual. And the second thing is his great clarity about fascism and his willingness to speak out about fascism and militarism. The more I read about who speaks out about such things, the more I appreciate what a rare compassion he had in human life. I said, yes, I agree, but I'd say the way he spoke out was expressed much, much more subtly there than here, like we did during the Vietnam War. And she said, yes, his willingness ultimately to die in the U.S. is very unusual. It's hard for me to understand what a big deal that was until I went to Japan and found out that that's the real world to them. I said, Deshimaru died on the plane going back to Japan. After years and years of teaching in France, he said, I've got to die in Japan. And he was a real renegade. He was a guy that rejected all the norms. But anyway, it seems that as he approached death, he felt compelled to go back. Yvonne says, Suzuki Roshi made the decision to die here. Yeah, I'll agree. You'll notice a few times in Crooked Cucumber, people say, he's going to become American soil. And so it was a real decision to him to stay in America and die in America. And even while he was dying, at one point he said, I've got to go back. He said to his son, while he, Hoitsu was there, so I don't know, that's a month before he died. He said, I have to go back to Japan. I have to go back and be in Japan, die there. And Hoitsu said, oh, okay, we'll make arrangements and this and that. And then he said, what are you talking about? I'm not leaving here or something, He just expressed that feeling he had and then went, nah, I'm just saying it. She says, another thing I'm wondering about, he used to tell about his teacher saying to him how sorry he was that Suzuki was destined to have only poor students. I do remember protesting when he first said that, but in hindsight, I guess his teacher was right. If you look at his line, it is at least troubled. Some wouldn't agree with me. What was it his teacher saw that led him to say that he was ambitious to make big institutional changes in the Soto Zen hierarchy and structure? Maybe he felt like what would happen in the U.S. might have some influence. And I say, I think of Oksan, Mrs. Suzuki, Oksan means wife, saying, what are you thinking about all the time? And he said, Buddhism in America, how to establish Buddhism in America. That was pretty ambitious, thinking of the big picture. Yvonne says, he would also see possibilities, like when he first met Mary Shannon. Mary Shannon was one of the East Coast women, sort of, there was this group of fairly wealthier society type East Coast women. That might be an unfair term for me to use, but, well-placed East Coast women that got into Buddhism and got into sitting, and that Suzuki had a relationship with, and that they would come to Tassajara, and he met some of them on the East Coast, one of the few times he went there. Anyway, Yvonne says, he always went like this with his fingers, making the outlines of her enormous glasses that she wore, and it made him think of her as a bug. She was part of the elegant New York ladies group, a designer, made denim in colors and stripes, effective and respectful designer in the textile world, and she was the one who suggested Zen Center do the bakery, also as a place where people would meet and drink coffee. And the stitchery, she had this notion too. There was an Elias Stitchery. It might still be going. Karen Jordan owned it. The Tassara Bakery went on for years and years and finally went out of business around, in the early 1990s, I'd say. When it started, there was nothing else like it. And by the time it went out of business, there was just so much like that. And, its time had passed. Sad. It was so great. On Cole and Parnassus in San Francisco. And the stitchery, she had this notion that doing businesses like those would be a kind of extension of what Zen practice was like out into the ordinary world. Dick Baker was still in Japan. These ideas people associate with him, but Mary was the person who had clear ideas about these businesses, and Suzuki Roshi said it was a very good idea. We should do these things and we should listen to her. She sent clothing designs that she developed when she was living in the Southwest, adapted certain traditional clothing designs from the Southwest that could be interesting to people from all over the U.S. She sent models of designs with the idea that Elias Stitchery would start producing a line of simple, well-made clothes using interesting fabrics. She had a clear concept of the businesses as a way to support Zen Center, but also as a way of expressing something in that realm that would draw people in. She lived at Green Gulch for a while and used to come out every year. She lives in New York, is elderly and frail, but very lively. She used to talk to Suzuki Roshi, and he respected her. Now, here, Yvonne and I have been talking about this book I've just started working on about Suzuki, and so she's giving me some advice. There are certain themes that are big themes in Buddhism in the West. His openness to practice with some pretty funky folks coming from a priestly monastic frame, or reference his willingness to practice with hippies, lay people, women, all the things he had to say about us as practitioners, seeing something about the freshness and enthusiasm that Americans have. And so there are all these ways in which his openness and accessibility and his ability to teach in the ways that he thought were possible to teach. It's like he was this changeling from Japan, and I think it's a piece of his story that's really interesting. The times were important, and he saw that something was happening with the psychedelics and hippies and the times. People were turning to practicing religion. And I think it's important to preserve the original form of the Zen Mind Beginner's Mind lectures so anyone could access it. And then with them and with all his lectures, we could have various editions. And she says, but Zen Center wouldn't tolerate that, wouldn't let loose of control they have over what happens to that material. Ha-ha! Wrong, Yvonne. It's all happening. It's all been done. And they do tolerate it, and they use it now. But she's right, man. That's where it started. It started like going up against a brick wall. Hey, that's cool. It's cool to read that. Remember, this is 94. This is 26 years ago. And I said, we should make it public. And that's how I feel about all this info. I'll make a book, but I'll have a larger database for anyone else to do what they want to do with it. Wow. That's interesting to read me saying that. I didn't know I was thinking that back. Yeah, I forget that. So Yvonne says, there are some themes that might give elements of structure. You should turn from an historical approach to turn to a spiritual realm like the way Tassajara burst on the American imagination. Not the first, but the second brochure that went to 30,000 people. And it was like scattershot, but it put Suzuki Roshi Tassajara Zen Center on the map of people's minds in a way that couldn't happen in the 50s or in the 70s or 80s. And I say, Suzuki, in so many people's minds, is so important, like Thomas More. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind must be the biggest selling book on Zen Buddhism in the world. Well, maybe it was then, maybe, I don't know. It's done well. It's used as a text for college classes. It's read widely. So many people know Suzuki Roshi through that book. Yvonne said, Lawrence Rockefeller, I hear, keeps it by his bed, carries it with him. I said, maybe it can't be reproduced, can't be done again. She says, that's right. But to try to understand who that person was is important. And it's important that Trudy worked on it, that she was a woman, and that she had clearly an extraordinary understanding of his teaching, his openness to women practitioners from early on, even though he was still remarkably open to women. The collaboration between Suzuki Roshi and Trudy. Well, Dick Baker was involved in that more. It was the three of them, really. But Trudy was doing most of the work with the editing. And then she says, Dick Baker did the whole thing with Weatherhill and published the book, and he did the look at it. But the really important thing in Suzuki Roshi's mind was the work with Trudy. Look at how he ordained Jean Ross. Well, he didn't ordain her, but he sent her to Japan, and he would say, my friend ordained her. So he felt she was ordained for him. So what she says is right there. And she says, Suzuki Roshi admitted he was, after he sent Dick to Japan. He said he did it because he didn't know what to do with him, and he wanted to try something. He wanted to get him out of Zen Center for a while to give other people a chance to develop. And I say, do you know who told me the exact same thing? And she says, who? I said, Dick. She says, I also think that Suzuki Roshi saw Dick's ability to make an institution a vehicle that would carry Buddhism and his teaching and practice, and he absolutely counted on Katagiri being present to be the real spiritual practice person. I say, you really think so? She said, yes, I do. No, I don't know if I agree with you on that, Yvonne. But anyway, she says, I think it's why when Katagiri Roshi resigned from Zen Center the way he did publicly, in a way that didn't leave Suzuki Roshi any room for renegotiating with him, that it was a terrible blow to Suzuki Roshi. And I heard that Okusan say that's what killed him. Yeah, but it's just talk. Suzuki also said he didn't want us to have any more Japanese teachers. But Katagiri was part of the family. The thing is that Suzuki took Katagiri for granted. It was another one of his errors of omission, of not giving him any strokes. I mean, Katagiri said he never thanked me. And I said, well, actually, he did thank you. He thanked you that last meeting we had together, and in which Katagiri cried. But that wasn't Suzuki's way, and that's not the Japanese way. It's all unspoken understandings. But Katagiri wanted his own temple with his own lineage, and Suzuki should have understood that. Katagiri didn't want to be in Suzuki's shadow forever, and unlike we Americans, is that we or us? All right, unlike we, us Americans, Katagiri, they were from the same culture. Katagiri could see his faults. I mean, he'd tell me, he's not as perfect as you all think he is. So I said to Yvonne, what are the important questions? We're talking about, she'd give me advice on doing a book about Suzuki. She says, there are a few questions for everybody. What they learned from him, what was his effect on him. Some people ask, what were his weaknesses? And what was his greatness? And she says he's been very idealized by students while alive and as well as later. She says, my experience is that he was completely willing to be who he was and how he was. Once driving Suzuki Roshi and Suzuki Okusan back from Tassajara, we stopped in Pacific Grove for lunch in a place on the water. I just rest a little at a cove where surfers get into the water on the south end of the bay. I remember sitting there facing them and Suzuki Roshi telling me what a terrible father and husband he'd been, and in respect that it was probably a mistake for him to have tried to be a father and husband, giving that really what was important to him and all he ever really thought about were his students, and how readily Okusan agreed with him. I said, yeah, she still makes that point. Good priest, bad husband. Yvonne says, yeah, well, it's one thing for her to make it, but it's another for him to be so clearly acknowledge that was what was really vital for him, what was going on with his students. Yvonne says, further on, I just skipped a whole bunch of stuff. I was thinking about the way Suzuki Roshi would work with the students who he thought were serious and where there was some real connection. His ignoring someone for a long period of time, even a year or so that the only way to have any interaction was to channel you into the Dokusan room, and how few people he seemed to have that kind of relationship to, how much we as American students took it personally and got hurt feelings. I said, yeah, he did that to Mike Dixon, to Dick Baker, to Philip Wilson, and to Reb. And she says, clearly it was an indication that he was taking someone quite seriously. She said, I think he did it with Trudy, too. And I said, well, I think it's pretty traditional, incidentally. He never did that with me. She said, yeah, I think so. It's a way of cutting out the personal, social, familial relationship so that it would throw the student on himself or herself. How little confidence he had that American students would stick around. One of the things that interests me is that he had a pretty low opinion of what it would take to discourage us. We could be easily discouraged. Yeah. And I said, yeah, in a lecture, he said, I can't tell you the truth. If I told you the truth, I'd just be sitting here by myself, listening to the sound of your cars going up the road. She says, it also shows up in his reluctance to talk about reincarnation. Maybe that's just not a topic that Japanese people talk about anyway. And it may be that in the Zen tradition in Japan, it's not talked about very much, but that's pretty unusual in the teachings of the Buddha throughout all the other Asian cultures that I know. Well, I remember visiting a man I knew, an older gentleman, who was dying, Japanese man, and he told me he wanted to be reborn as an American. I said, well, you probably will then. And then I say, well, you know, Yasutani said at Tassajara that you have to believe in reincarnation in order to be a Buddhist. And Yvonne said, when Taro Rinpoche said that at Green Gulch, it caused people to be upset. And I say, well, Dick Baker said he doesn't believe in reincarnation. David Padwa doesn't. There are Buddhists who don't. Well, look, maybe at some point David Padwa said that, but I don't think that would be true now. I don't know. Yvonne says, Taro Rinpoche said you can't be a Buddhist if you don't accept the teachings of the past and future lives. I remember Norman just went through the ceiling, but 2 years later he said, I think I understand it now. Well, personally, David Chadwick, grew up believing in reincarnation. I told Richard Baker that once, and he said, "Oh, that's the best reason to believe in it." I said, "My mother believed in reincarnation. How can I not? I can't imagine a cosmic view without reincarnation." And Yvonne says, "I just came back from an institute in Arizona where there were 8 teachers from 4 different traditions. Everybody except Robert Aiken held to the teaching of past and future lives and the importance of cause and effect." Well, God, you've got to believe in the importance of cause and effect. Bob was the one who did the Zen thing of "I don't know" and seemed not to get that intellectually. It's a very important teaching to understand because a lot emanates out from that teaching. But here was another important teaching that Suzuki Roshi chose for one reason or another not to bring forth. In fact, he seemed to have some reluctance about bringing it up because it seemed that he feared American students would run away. No, I don't think that's why, Yvonne. I think he felt they would run with it. You know, he wanted people to focus on their practice now and not to obsess about, thinking about past and future lives and psychic stuff. It's okay. It's a good approach. Even though I grew up believing in reincarnation, I do not think about it. Well, maybe a little. But, it's like aliens, UFOs. I'm not experiencing it now. I'm experiencing this, okay? That's enough. So we go on talking about that, and I'm saying, no, I don't think he's thinking about running people away. Like he said, when I was young, I was interested in astrology, Chinese astrology. And then finally, I came to the conclusion it's not necessary to know so much about yourself. I said, now I think that that's more of a rejection of interpretive systems that interfere with our intuition, which does all that work naturally. She says, well, that I don't know. But I know from conversations with him that he, in fact, did say that people would run away if he talked about reincarnation. And it's interesting to me thinking about that, to think of how many breaks he had on himself, depending on what he thought students were ready for. Really? Over and over again, when the subject would come up, I'd see him touch it as little as possible and then back away. He seemed to think that with few exceptions, it was something American students would balk at. It's interesting. I have the same disagreement with her now that I did back then. And then I'd say, well, maybe that was an influence from Dick because, Dick didn't see things that way. Then here's Yvonne speaking again. I actually think he's right. It's one of the major stumbling blocks that I run into. It's one of the subjects that people have the most difficulty with. Most people who grew up in the West come out of the philosophical tradition of materialism. Well, that's true. I think it's interesting as an indicator of his interest in being skillful and keeping students long enough for them to eventually really get the Buddha Dharma in some deep way, and his willingness to keep some things quite hidden if that's what it took. My experience of taking care of him while he was dying, which was such an extraordinary, powerful experience. I think his own ease with the dying process had something to do with his own deep understanding and acceptance of the teachings on past and future lives. People who believe in reincarnation have a different relationship to their own mortality. He was very clear and consistent, really absent of any kind of fear. The only shadow was his feeling of, I don't have time to do what I want to do before I die. I don't have time to do the things that I need to do to have things work out okay. I think he had a real panic about what he had set in motion vis-a-vis Dick being his successor without the right surroundings, all the karma of Katagiri Roshi's decision of not stick around. He had a clear amount of agitation or eagerness because he had some things he wanted to do before he died and actually kept thinking he was going to live longer than he was going to do so when he realized he wasn't going to live very much longer that was hard for him, but not out of fear. My experience in Japan is also that nobody thinks much about reincarnation. I say, well, maybe Japanese Buddhism doesn't emphasize reincarnation, but it's not devoid of it either. Yvonne's talking about Japan here. She says, all the stuff that comes up around ceremonies, around death, it's a very odd combination of magical thinking, superstition, and Buddhism mixed in. There's the idea that if an aborted child is not appeased, it will come and make big trouble for the family. That's true. A lot of superstition there. And here in Bali, where I live. And then I'd say, and then there's the Obon festival when spirits are said to come back. They're into spirits. They're into spirits here too. Like, they're Hindu here, but they're really into the spirits. They're really into the animism. And Japanese is Buddhist, but it's really into the animism, into the spirits. She said Suzuki Roshi had a study at Page Street. What he had was a closet. He walked through the closet to another one behind it that had a skylight, or it was on the second floor behind his bedroom, and it had a window. Yeah, he only let me in there a few times, and it was like a real secret place where he would go when nobody knew where to find him. He studied there all the time, texts. I remember one time when Bill Sterling and I discovered that Katagiri didn't have the complete canon, or whatever. Anyway, the more I understand the early scriptures and Abhidharma, the more I understand how classical the teaching is in Zen mind, beginner's mind. It's a very skillful series of teachings that's quite classical and complete. You can read it like it's some nice old Zen teacher giving lectures to suburban types in Palo Alto, Los Altos. But it's also a very classical teaching, and I think it's easy not to go deep enough into it and not to realize that one's own understanding is enhanced by studying the classical texts and commentaries. Beginner's mind, for example, is a brilliant term that translates a goal that is described in the Abhidharma literature, namely cultivating the capacity to see each thing as though for the first time. It's just straight out of those texts. I think that the degree to which Suzuki Roshi had a practice of studying, of using his intelligence and studying in a rather classical, scholarly way as a legitimate aspect and structure for practice, even though that wasn't the official or popular or romanticized picture of Zen, I think it's a very important aspect of him as a teacher to present. I think there's a big misunderstanding of what Zen is in the United States that is romantic and which stinks of Zen. Chop wood and carry water, just sit zazen. It picks up the anti-intellectual tone in Japanese culture from the perspective of our own American anti-intellectualism. It doesn't take into account enough the clear training aspect, mind training. The mind is at the core of what Zen practice is about. It's tough and clear and can be talked about. Katagiri Roshi knew it was important to study the early sutras. And Yvonne says, and you need to do your own work in emotional, psychological terms in the context of your own culture, or you're only half-baked. I know people in the Tibetan and Theravadan traditions and others that are not effective teachers for exactly the same reasons. I remember in the early days at Page Street, when we were doing all this stuff in the Buddha Hall, imagining there were pillars in different places, and we lined up as though they were there. And Suzuki Roshi said, I know how to teach you how to do certain things in the context in which I know them. You have to learn what I know in the context in which I know it, and then you have the ground in it to have your own experience as Americans. And I feel we had permission from him after some point to figure out what makes sense in this place, in this culture. That's one of the reasons I talked to him about a lot of the work I was doing with Harry Roberts and some other American people, because those are people who could tell someone coming from North European immigrant stock something about America. But I think that study is an important element in the reasoning with Suzuki Roshi's teaching. Now, she mentions Harry Roberts there. And Harry Roberts was one of Yvonne's teachers. And he ended up living and dying in her home. And Harry was a shaman who'd grown up with Indians and became a shaman. And he had students like Tim Buckley and Eric Larson, Dane Larson, others. And I was rather close with Harry, too. I wasn't his student, but he was something. Tim Buckley published a book on him with Harry's writings. It wasn't Tim's writings so much as Harry's writings. And there's a link. Look, just Google Harry Roberts on Kook.com. There's more I could put together on a page for him, and I have a note to do that. All right, Yvonne says, in 1970 in the spring, I went on a trip to the Southwest with Ron Patterson and John Steiner and Mary and David, friends of Ron's and Jack Elias. We went on a trip to the Havasupai Canyon, which is one of the side canyons that drains into the Colorado. We walked down there and camped there for a while with Havasupai Indians, went to the Grand Canyon, Canyon de Chelly, Haute Villa on First Mesa of the Hopi Reservation, and spent 5 days with Grandpa David. That's David Managa she's talking about. She says there were 3 of us who were Zen students. There were 3 who weren't, and then John was like the emissary between the 2 groups. I remember sitting in Grandpa David's little house in front of his son's wood stove the first day and a half there. Not a word, just sitting. The ones who were used to meditating were comfortable with that, and the others were climbing the walls. Anyway, when we went to Canyon de Chelly, we walked down into White House ruins. Yep, I've been there. That part of the canyon, and I had a very big experience down there. And coming back out of the canyon late in the day, it was as though I flew up the hill. I was in quite an altered, transcendental state. And part of what happened to me being in the canyon was a kind of opening to interdependence. And I stayed in a transcendent state for quite some time. But I particularly remember coming out of the canyon almost like floating. I was so blissed out, one might say. And when I got back to Zen Center in the city, I had a book of photos of the Navajo lands and Canyon de Chelly and that area. And I brought the book with me when I went to see Suzuki Roshi and tell him about the trip and what I'd learned and what I'd seen and what it was like. He opened the book and he brushed the pages quickly aside and came to the picture of the trail coming out of the White House ruins, and he said, "This is where it is. This is where it happened." Without my saying much at all, he knew that something big had happened to me, and he knew exactly when and where it happened. It was like some other level of communication had happened. It was really powerful. From that point on, he was very supportive of my interest in Native people and the hunger I had to know about the geology and the land and the plants and a sense of place, which he didn't think was weird at all. When I started doing camping trips with Harry Roberts, I told him a lot about that. I told him a lot about Grandpa David and the whole connection with the Hopi in particular. I told him that Grandpa David was very interested in the Heart Sutra and chanting the Heart Sutra. And I remember after sitting for a long while with him and his saying that it's wonderful that there's this sort of resonance between the spiritual path that you're on and the path that my people are on, but please honor your own path and don't try to be Indians, which I remember striking me because I also heard don't try to be Japanese either. And I say, I once went by David's house. I say Grandpa David or Chief David, people call him different things. Went to his house with Susan, my sister, and Bob Halpern, because we wanted to meet him. And he opened the door and said, "Come in, do you want to spend the night?" That's true. You'd never seen the three of us, and he said that. A few years later, I went by there and asked if he was around. When he didn't answer his door, and an old Indian guy said, "No, he's out with white people." And she says, also, Trungpa coming to Tassara and meeting Suzuki Roshi was something I was the agent of. And I say, yeah, a lot of people say that was a meeting of great importance. She says, that's a very exaggerated trip. Well, Yvonne and I disagreed on that. She liked Tartoku and the Dalai Lama and the more conventional and great Tibetan teachers, but Trungpa was, he just drank all the time and slept with his women students and everything, and no secret about any of it. And she just couldn't accept that. But listen, Suzuki and Trungpa were very close. And, if you just read what I've written about them, they make it pretty clear. Yvonne says, he's an illustration of the cultivation of patience. I see him teaching patience in a very physical way, in his pace, the way he walked, and the way he stood up after sitting. Not macho at all. I think that Zazen is a kind of feminizing principle in terms of cultivating receptivity, in terms of nurturing and gentle and recepting, and he completely demonstrates those qualities coming forth and at the same time being capable of an incredible power and energy and fierceness, which was manifested particularly in his moving rocks, the physicalness of his relationship to rocks. Remember the woman who was at Tassajara and did all those water basins? Yeah, that's Audrey Walter. He was so conscious of what she was doing with those stones, and that's very true. He saw she was skilled with stone, and he asked her to make a Buddha or something, and she did it, and they had a relationship that started. I mean, they were just there for the summer because he saw her working with stones. Okay, well, I could just keep reading about Yvonne and stuff from Yvonne for hour after hour, really. And I will be collecting more material that is on Cuke.com in one place or another, but which isn't linked to from her page. I'm gonna, that's a priority, and I'm going to do that as soon as I can. Maybe today, maybe within a week. So I got a picture of Yvonne taken shortly before she died. She looks good. I don't know how shortly before she died. Maybe the picture's not dated. But let's say taken this year. But Hillary includes under the picture Yvonne's words, Tuesday, August 18th. Now, she died on the 19th. The quote is, "No form, we just say thank you." And I say thank you, Yvonne, for being a great friend all these years, and a great woman, a great Buddhist, a great teacher, and always throwing all your life energy into helping others, including animals and plants. This has been another Gyuto audio podcast. If you want to help keep us going, just go to the homepage of Gyuto.com, hit the donate link up top or near the bottom, or the one at Gyuto Audio Podbean. And that takes you to the donate page. You can see how to send a check or make a PayPal donation, or become a subscriber, a PayPal subscriber for as little as $1 a month. We do appreciate it. It's easy to do, and you will find it a refreshing and rewarding experience. So until next time, this is DC Poobah of Gyuto Audio and Gyuto Archives with Dogge Bandita, Feline Cuchita, Dear Lovely Katrinka, whatever birds, roosters, and dogs and motorcycles coming from the outside, and we're all wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.